And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing a strip of ice here from the main ice pack down to St. Matthew Island. And with the cold northeast winds, the entire ice edge here will continue to advance southwestward and westward, even into Bristol Bay for the next several days. And for tonight's weather again, clear and cold and windy over the southern southeast areas there, especially into northern panhandle tonight with some light snow and warmer temperatures edging northward. Clear and cold, north slope, variable clouds for the Arctic coast. Chance of snow showers here, Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, and a little bit better chance of some widespread light precipitation, in the form of snow, mainly for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, almost to Atka Island. Dry and colder over the Bering Sea and continued windy, with dry and cold temperatures over the interior and increasing clouds, still a chance of moisture for Kodiak Island. Increasing clouds here, Prince William Sound and the North Gulf Coast into the southeastern Copper River Basin areas. And another trough brings chances of snow a little farther to the north in the Panhandle tomorrow with rain to the south. And then for Monday, warm front right across the northern Panhandle there. So north of that rain, north of that snow, south becoming a rain pattern there, mixed over the central part of the area. Increasing chances of snow, eastern Copper River Basin, and maybe trying to push into Cordova, but may or may not make it. And still a threat of some moisture on the east side of Kodiak Island, but a better chance of snow showers here for the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians, and some flurries for the western Arctic coast. Coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle, east-southeast winds at 20 to 30 knots. Central coast easterlies 30 to 35 knots. For the north coast, east winds 15 to 35 knots. Lynn Canal, good gales tomorrow out of the north, 40 knots, seas 12 feet. North 30 knots, Stevens Passage, and southeast at 15 for Clarence Strait. And for Monday, north winds coming down for Lynn Canal at 25 knots. And generally easterly winds at 20 knots for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait southeast at 20. Central and south coast here, looking at southeast winds at 20 knots with 8-foot seas. North coast east winds 20 to 25 knots with 8 to 9-foot seas. Prince William Sound northeast at 20 tomorrow. And for the North Gulf Coast, small craft advisories, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. North winds 30 knots for the Barren Islands. Gale warnings for Southern Cook Inlet, northeast winds 35 knots, northeast 40 knots for Kamishak Bay, 15 knots for Northern Cook Inlet. And north 15 for Northern Cook Inlet on Monday, and north 30 knots, Southern Cook Inlet. Gale warnings continue, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands here. North winds 35 knots, and northeast at 20 for Prince William Sound with 4-foot seas. And north to northeast winds 20 to 30 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island tomorrow, northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. Northeast 35 for Bristol Bay with 5-foot seas. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula. North to northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. And for Monday, Alaska Peninsula, not much change. Gale warnings, north to northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Northeast at 30 knots for Bristol Bay with 6-foot seas. Kodiak Island, north to northeast winds at 30 knots with 8-foot seas. Western Aleutians, Kiskadashimia, northeast winds at 30 knots. Otherwise, gale warnings here for Amchitka Island to Atka. In fact, even the eastern Aleutians, all those areas will see winds out of the northeast at 35 to 40 knots. And for Monday, Adak, Atka, Nikolsky on Alaska Island, all northeast at 40 knots for Monday. And Amchitka Island, northeast winds 35 knots. Small craft advisories for Kiskadashimia, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Pribilof Islands tomorrow, still windy, northeast winds at 40 knots, northeast 30 for St. Matthew Island. Gale warnings here along the Kuskokwim Delta coast from Nunivak Island southward for north winds at 35 knots. Yukon Delta coast, Norton Sound, and St. Lawrence Island, all looking at brisk wind advisories for north winds at 25. And for the Monday time frame, winds lighten up there for St. Lawrence Island to Norton Sound down to 15 knots out of the north, north 20 knots, Yukon Delta coast. Gale warnings Here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, north at 35 knots, northeast 35 knots for the Pribilof, and north at 25 knots for St. Matthew Island. And for the Chukchi Sea for Sunday, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, light westerlies at 10 knots for the western Arctic coast, central coast up here, eastward to demarcation point, west winds at 15 knots. And Monday, becoming more of a variable wind pattern here on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast at 10 to 15 knots, but southeast 20 for the central coast. First going to advisories for the western Arctic coast, southeast winds increasing to 25 knots, and south to southeast winds 20 to 35 knots for the Chukchi Sea.